be looking at American history in a way that some of you may never have heard it told before. And we're going to start with one of the most tragic events in American history, Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941. About 2,000 Americans dead, 18 ships, including 8 battleships, sunk or heavily damaged, about 200 planes destroyed on the ground, many more damaged. A very tragic day for America. Now, here's a question for you. What question do you think Americans were asking the day after Pearl Harbor, besides what's going to happen next? What question do you think Americans were asking the next day? And, yeah, how could such a tragedy have befallen us? How were we caught off guard? Well, President Roosevelt appointed a commission to answer that question. It's called the Roberts Commission. And the Roberts Commission could be called very Washington-friendly. Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, who headed it, was very close to Roosevelt, and retired Admiral Joseph Reeves had been given a job in Lend-Lease by Roosevelt. The 2 Army generals on the commission, one was on the personal staff of General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, was chosen as a recommendation. The other was his close personal friend. Well, the commission conducted 19 days of hearings, 3 in Washington and 16 in Hawaii. And at the conclusion, they issued an official report in which they said that Washington, prior to Pearl Harbor, had discharged its duties in an exemplary manner. They said all the blame for Pearl Harbor lay with our 2 commanders there, namely Admiral Husband Kimmel, who's on the left, of course, the Pacific Fleet commander in Hawaii, and General Walter C. Short, the Army commander there. They said these men were guilty of dereliction of duty. They had failed to take adequate surveillance measures of the waters surrounding Hawaii. And in the headlines across America, the words dereliction of duty appeared, and these 2 were inundated with hate mail and death threats. Congressmen stood up and said they should be shot. They're responsible for the deaths of 2,000 Americans. Well, Kimmel and Short protested the findings of the Roberts Commission. They pointed out there were a number of irregularities. Justice Roberts had taken unsworn testimony for a good portion of the hearings. He had refused them the right to have fellow officers serve as their attorneys. They were not allowed the right to ask witnesses questions, and they also found that significant testimony was left out of the commission's report. So Kimmel and Short did something that's very unusual for an officer to ask for. They requested that they be court-martialed. But President Roosevelt refused. He said, no court-martials. These men, I've already relieved them of their duties. We're at war now. What good could come of a court-martial? But Kimmel and Short kept pressing their case, and Congress did too. They also wanted court-martials. And finally, in 1944, Congress mandated that the hearings take place. Members of Congress said, hey, we're obviously winning the war now. What's the big deal about letting these 2 guys have their day in court? So in 1944, the Naval Court of Inquiry and the Army Pearl Harbor Board convened. Now, at these 2 proceedings, the attorneys for Kimmel and Short presented undeniable evidence that Washington had complete foreknowledge of the attack, but denied that information to the 2 commanders. As the admirals on the Naval Court of Inquiry heard that evidence being read, they threw their pencils on the ground in disgust. Admiral Kimmel was completely exonerated by the court, and all blame was placed on Washington. Now, of course, President Roosevelt was outside their official jurisdiction. He couldn't be named, but everybody knew who was being implicated. The Army Pearl Harbor Board also reached the same conclusion, that Washington had full foreknowledge of the attack, and here are their closing words in their official report. Up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States. You can see that report online these days. Now, question to ask is, the public reacted with hate mail and death threats to the charge of dereliction of duty. How do you think the public responded to their exoneration of these 2 officers, to the news that Washington had known about the attack? And the answer is the public didn't respond because the public didn't know. President Roosevelt ordered that the results be quashed and held top secret in the interest of securing the war effort. However, after World War II, a number of forthright authors attempted to bring the truth to the public's attention. For example, in the 1950s, this book came out, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, subtitled The Washington Contribution by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack, commanding destroyers. There are several books like this. You know what? They didn't get media attention. They didn't get reviews in Time Magazine or the New York Times, and were generally ignored. So most people didn't know these books were even out there. But a real breakthrough came in 1982 when John Toland, the Dean of World War II Historians, Pulitzer Prize winner, undisputed historian, published this book called Infamy, Pearl Harbor and its Aftermath. because at this point, a great many witnesses had come forward who had not come forward at the time of the court-martial. Now, following the publication of Toland's book, I was asked to do a cover story. This is back in 1986 for the New American on Pearl Harbor, summarizing what Toland and other writers had said. And then in 1989, the BBC produced this documentary, Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor, which you can buy online. And the BBC's documentary repeated everything we'd said in the New American, and that's now been aired on the History Channel. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, wait a minute, Mr. Perloff, you're saying that Washington knew about the attack. Now, isn't that just sensationalism? What is the evidence for that? Well, Washington knew about the attack from several sources. One was the Purple Code, which is the name given to the code that Japan used to communicate with its embassies and major consulates around the world. It's a very complicated code, so complicated it had to be enciphered and deciphered by machine. The Japanese were convinced no one could break it. But in 1940, a talented group of American crypto analysts did break that code. So in 1941, when our relations with Japan were tense, we were reading Japan's messages on a same-day basis. Every message was translated within 24 hours, and every day those messages went to President Roosevelt, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, and Harold Stark, of the U.S. Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations. Now, what did these messages reveal? They revealed that the Japanese had ordered their spies in Hawaii to start sending Tokyo the exact locations of our ships in dock in Pearl Harbor. Now, there's nothing unusual about spies watching ship movements, but when they want to know the exact locations of your ships in dock, the only implication is that your ships have been targeted. And as Pearl Harbor Day approached, Tokyo requested that the frequency of these reports be stepped up. The Purple Code transcripts also revealed that the Japanese in Germany had told the Germans that war with the United States is about to break out. They revealed that the Japanese had told their consulates and their embassy here in the United States to start burning all of their secret documents and their code books. Why? As soon as the war started, the Japanese knew they're going to lose their diplomatic immunity. Now, I don't know if any of you saw a movie called Tora, Tora, Tora. In that movie, they showed the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, and that's the real Cordell Hull there. In the movie, the Japanese ambassador is given a declaration of war following the attack, and he reacts with utter shock and surprise. But in real life, Cordell Hull had already read the Japanese declaration of war the day before in his own office. He read his transcript of it that had been given to him by the crypto analysts, 13 parts of that 14-part message, as had President Roosevelt. Now, Washington also knew from a number of other sources. Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, had told Roosevelt, based on information received from the Peruvian embassy in Tokyo, that if relations got worse with the U.S., Japan planned to attack Pearl Harbor with all its strength and with all its might. J. Edgar Hoover, according to eyewitness testimony, also informed the president, based on information received from a Yugoslavian double agent named Dusko Popov, who you can see interviewed on the BBC documentary I mentioned before. Popov was working for both us and the Germans, but his true loyalty was to us. It seems the Japanese had gone to the Germans to ask their advice on how to approach the attack on Pearl Harbor. Popov got that information to Hoover, who gave it to FDR, the president. Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe was a U.S. military observer in Java, which was at that time under the control of the Dutch. Now, the Dutch had also broken Japan's diplomatic codes, had learned of the Pearl Harbor attack, and warned General Thorpe. General Thorpe thought this was so serious, he sent a total of 4 warnings to Washington until finally General Marshall's office told him, send no further warnings concerning Pearl Harbor. And you can see General Thorpe interviewed on the BBC documentary, Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor. Colonel F.G.L. Weigerman was the Dutch military attaché in Washington. He has testified that he personally warned General Marshall of the attack. And Senator Guy Gillette and Congressman Martin Dies both independently received warnings of the attack. Both men later stated they had told President Roosevelt about the warnings they'd received. And in both cases, he told them to just leave the information in his hands, the president's hands, and not to share it with anyone else. Now, in 2001, Disney released this movie, Pearl Harbor, starring Ben Affleck. It's a very standard rendering of the attack. FDR portrayed as a great hero. He's totally surprised. And the producer of that movie, Jerry Bruckheimer, used very impolite language to describe anyone who would suggest otherwise. So in response to that, the New American Magazine asked me to do a new cover story on Pearl Harbor because at this point we had more information, in particular from this book, Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor by Robert Stinnett. Stinnett really broke new ground in the investigation of Pearl Harbor. Through the Freedom of Information Act, he was able to prove we'd not only broken the diplomatic code, we had also broken Japan's naval codes before Pearl Harbor. This is something no one had known before outside of official circles. We had always assumed that the Japanese maintained complete radio silence as they approached Pearl Harbor. They did not. They maintained discretion, but not silence. They broke silence on a number of occasions, and the most important message was certainly this one. Admiral Yamamoto, the Japanese First Air Fleet, November the 26th, 1941. The task force keep its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day, exact date to be given by later order. Now, no one can read that and not understand its implications. I'd like to mention that following publication of our articles in the New American, I received a note of thanks from Colonel Walter C. Short, U.S. Army retired, son of the late Pearl Harbor commander. We were also contacted by the attorney for the Kimmel family, who requested permission to use one of our New American articles in their own efforts to exonerate Admiral Kimmel. And I'd also like to mention that by a resolution of the United States Congress, Kimmel and Short have been exonerated of any wrongdoing in the matter of Pearl Harbor. But how many people know that? How many people even know there's any controversy about Pearl Harbor? Because you know what? You don't read about this stuff in the New York Times. You don't read about it in public school history books. Well, as we're going to find out tonight, there's a lot of things you don't find in those types of sources. Let's go back to World War I now.